Boa tarde. Estou muito feliz por estar aqui hoje. Okay? It really truly is such an honor and a privilege to be here in Belo Horizonte to join in the homage to Ms. ABRADT, who, as you know, is an international figure and someone who I personally admire very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And also I'd like to thank my distinguished panelists who have already raised some very interesting and difficult issues. Now, I can tell you that the translation is very nice. It's very good, I think. I don't know what you're saying. I know what he's saying. And I know that they have those in the hallway, so if I'm not speaking clearly enough and you, I think, can get this into Portuguese, should you desire it. So I thought on this occasion that it would be a good chance to talk about what I think of as this new international order that's being created in a place where I think there might be some tension about a group creating an international order without you. So I bring this to the table today knowing that when I talk about the OECD, that Brazil is not a member of the OECD. And that Brazil was not asked to begin formulating the new international order, and that there are consequences to that, I think. And so that's why I wanted to talk about this. Before, however, I get into the details of BEPS, I want to make sure that we have a similar vocabulary because I'm going to talk about norm transmission or diffusion, and I'm going to talk about hard law and soft law, because I think it's really important to understand how the OECD is doing what it's doing, whether or not Brazil or any other country individually is on board with the prescriptions. So just a quick slide here on hard law to soft law. So by hard law, I mean the rule of law. Soft law is more of a pluralism, things that aren't law but that we do anyway. And with hard law, we know that we have a hierarchical power structure, some of which was already discussed today, and I'm sure will be discussed, where you have rules being set down from above and they have to be followed, and we'll come back to that some more. But soft law is more of a diplomatic power structure where you negotiate and you discuss and you collaborate and you hope that people will do what they say they'll do. And so then, commensurate with that, hard law is about detailed rules and definitions, whereas soft laws are usually pronounced in the form of generalities and aspirations. And this is going with the last part of law, which I think has been the theme that has been discussed here, which is that hard law has a credible threat of consequences. And hard laws should be, ideally, overtly expressed so everyone knows what it is, so that they can follow, and then when they don't follow, force is likely to compel compliance. And soft law doesn't have that necessarily. There's a variability in credibility of the threat. It's not usually expressed overtly what will happen if you don't go along, but it could be implied. And using force is really tricky. But it doesn't mean that we don't use force, it just means that we use different kinds of force because we don't have a military power backing it up. Okay, so if that's okay as far as the vocabulary goes, then this description of the international tax order, I think, as I see it, you will probably agree with me that, oh, I'm sorry, I missed something on that last slide. And that's to say that this is a spectrum. We don't have hard law and soft law separated, but we go from hard law to soft law. And we see elements of these cropping up when we have norm diffusion events like what's happening with BEPS. Okay. So this is, I think, a description of the international tax order, the place we find ourselves when the OECD begins to talk about BEPS. And that is that we do have hard law, legal instruments in the international tax order. We have domestic law, which impacts international transactions, subject of the last speaker. We have domestic tax treaties and tax information exchange agreements, which are bilateral agreements, but they're law, they're hard law. You may question whether there's a lot of force involved in the treaty, but people do seem to follow them. We have competent authority agreements. Competent authority is the person, as you probably know, that implements the tax treaty, and they have the power to act on behalf of the country to resolve problems not resolved by the treaty. And we have now IGAs, intergovernmental agreements, which I think are not law at all, but to the extent they are law, they're hard law. And if you'd like to know why I don't think they're law at all, I'd be happy to refer you to a paper, but that's another topic for another day. And then in international terms, we have a few multilateral agreements. A couple of these are really getting to be important. One is this Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters, which is an agreement, a multilateral agreement to assist in the enforcement and collection of taxes across borders. And we have this multilateral competent authority agreement, which is again between the competent authorities, and this is for the common reporting standard. So these are hard laws that we had before the OECD started talking about BEPS. So there's a structure, that's the foundation. But it's not the only thing, obviously, in the international tax order, and in fact, it's not even necessarily the first thing people think of when they talk about the international tax order. What do we really think of? Well, we think of the model treaties and the commentaries and the transfer pricing guidelines. The OECD especially, but also the UN and maybe to some extent the US models are not law, they're not hard law. And yet they become the base for hard law. They become very influential. And they become something that even countries start to cite as if they were law. As a reflection of the intention of the parties who enter into actual laws, bilateral treaties, for example. So you have commentaries, you also have in the US Treasury explanations, you have these instruments which are not law, but have a law-like character, soft law. And then you have the transfer pricing guidelines and the guidelines for multinational companies, again, issued by the OECD. And the point of these documents is not to say this is the law, because they can't do that, the OECD is not a lawmaking body, but to say, wouldn't it be grand if everyone did this way, and then we would have coherent international taxation, and to the extent you don't do it that way, well, what's wrong with you? And that's a difficult line to back up, but it's a very comfortable place to start if what you're trying to do is build some sort of an order. And then finally, before BEPS came along, we also had this third aspect of the international tax order, and it's collaboration and monitoring. So you didn't see this a whole lot unless you were a big fan or someone really observing very carefully the Harmful Tax Practices Project. But what you have is collaboration in the form of working parties. That's at the OECD, to a lesser extent in the UN, where experts from different countries get together and talk about their mutual approaches to problem solving and come up with consensus positions and then issue them in the form of those things you saw, the model treaties and commentaries and so on. But we also have these forums. Now these are important, they're becoming more important. I think when the OECD first created the forum, the Global Forum and the Harmful Tax Practices Forum, people said, okay, well that's happening, but it's just something on harmful tax practices. But as we'll see, once you build a structure, you return to that structure when you want to expand your influence. And so we see that we built the OECD built the Harmful Tax Practices Forum to, in some way, include in some kind of conversation the non-OECD countries that were punished as a result of the Harmful Tax Practices initiative from the late 90s. So we can come back to that a little bit more later. But these forums serve two purposes. One, it's to allow countries to watch each other, monitor each other, and write reports about each other, and which leads to the second, which is a convergence or harmonization at the norm level instead of the law level. You can't tell a country what to do, necessarily, at least not backed by force, but you could point out to a country, here's our standard, you're not doing what our standard says. What are you going to do now? And that can be a very powerful instrument, depending on which country is on which side of that discussion. So then along comes BEPS. As you know, the G20 announced BEPS as a problem in 2012. By 2013, working parties had been formed. By the end of 2014, we had action plans, and by the end of 2015, we had 15 reports, OECD action plans, to bring the world to a solution on BEPS. So what does or will BEPS add to this international tax order? Well, coming back to legal instruments, BEPS for the first time has the OECD proposing changes to domestic laws and to double tax treaties from the OECD. So the OECD for the first time has written model legislation. And they're also working on a new double tax treaty, multilateral treaty, which is called the multilateral instrument, which, if the OECD manages to pull this off, will in one move add to or amplify or enhance, it depends on who you talk to, all 3,000 of the world's treaties that are based on the OECD model. So this instrument is not a bilateral treaty, but it is a multilateral treaty that instantly works with or coordinates with the 3,000 bilateral treaties. But this multilateral instrument is being negotiated right now at the OECD. And then we add one more thing, and multilateral competent authority agreement, another one, to implement country-by-country reporting. So you have these new legal instruments coming out of the OECD. Some of them are, the multilateral instrument is wholly new, and changes to domestic law from a model legislation is a new idea. But we also have model treaties and guidance being changed. We'll see changes to the OECD model, and we'll see changes to the commentaries and the transfer pricing guidelines. So that's the OECD's normal workflow, just another cycle of it through the BEPS process. But finally, the last category of collaboration and monitoring is one to watch. Because now the OECD has decided that in order to make BEPS global, the OECD itself has to at least have the appearance of being global. And so the OECD has created something called the Inclusive Framework. The Inclusive Framework is all OECD countries and any country that agrees to the BEPS standards. And countries that are agreeing to the BEPS standards are called BEPS associates. So I usually make a small joke right here that doesn't really work that well, but we're going to try it anyway. I don't know what's going to happen in the translation, we'll see. Lawyers know that when you're an associate, you do, what do? You do what the partner tells you to do. And when you're a partner, you're the one who gets to say what is done. So when you decide, well, that was the joke, it's not very funny, is it? But when you decide that you're going to have BEPS associates, I think you've already framed what it means to be one of those. It's not a partner. Well, we'll come back to that. The BEPS associates are included in the inclusive framework after they agree already to BEPS. The action plans to date. And then the thing that they will mostly agree to in the inclusive framework is to join the forums and subject themselves to peer review of the various BEPS standards. We're going to come back to this, but I just want to establish this order that's being set up, that's being very carefully constructed, and it's complicated. Because if you're not a BEPS associate, you're completely excluded. But if you are a BEPS associate, you've already agreed to something, and now all you're agreeing to is implementing it. So that has consequences, I think, for the future of international tax. So how will BEPS work? As you probably know, there are 3 tiers, and there are 5 ways. You may know about the 3 tiers, you might not know or realize about the 5 ways. But the 3 tiers are as follows. There are minimum standards. There are recommendations, and there are best practices. The OECD has created these categories, and it's like lawyers should be, it pays to pay attention, be very prudent about which terminology you use. Because we've already seen some slippage where things that are actually recommendations or best practices are being described as if they were standards. But the OECD is being very careful about what it says as a standard because there's so much political and social meaning to what the OECD is doing when it declares these things. And the 5 ways that you may not be aware, but it was outlined in the prior slides, is that we will have domestic law and practice changes. Brazil is currently considering, I assume, changes to the domestic law to comply or be aligned with BEPS as BEPS associate. Changes to bilateral treaties, the new multilateral instrument, changes to the OECD model and guidance, and peer review and monitoring. So these are the 5 ways that will get each of those minimum standards, recommendations, and best practices to work. So as we look at the world that the BEPS is creating, that the OECD is creating with BEPS, we have to keep in mind that the OECD has these 5 tools, but it only deploys them to certain purposes. And we're going to see that using the different tools has different consequences, and we'll have different expectations about what will happen. So I think you know these, but I just want to quickly run through them. The minimum standards are things that all OECD and G20 countries committed to consistent implementation around. So note, BEPS associates are not listed here, but BEPS associates are expected to agree. This is to be monitored via the inclusive framework. There are 2 do's and 2 don'ts. All those 15 action plans, all the hours, all the reports, all the thousands of pages, they come down to this. 2 do's and 2 don'ts that are minimum standards. Don't use harmful tax practices, which the OECD interprets to mean adopt a nexus rule for intellectual property. Don't allow treaty shopping, which the OECD interprets to mean adopt principal purpose tests or limitation on benefit tests or anti-conduit tests or some combination of those to your treaties. And then do 2 do's. Do country-by-country reporting, which is for large multinationals, and do better with dispute resolution, which is the oddest consensus I've ever seen, which says do better at something. Everyone, you must do better. I don't know how you are going to measure that, but the OECD interprets this to mean achieve an average of 24 months for MAP resolution, for mutual agreement procedure resolution. Well, unless you intend for countries to concede on important points at the 24-month mark, I'm not sure how achieving 24 months for MAP resolution is an improvement to dispute resolution, but I can understand that it might make tax managers sitting on tax refunds happier if they think there's an end to a process, whether a good end or bad end. So those are the 4 minimum standards. We're going to come back to those in the last minute of this presentation, but for the time being, we'll look at the recommendations and the best standards. Well, the recommendations, there are several, and they are an agreed general direction. That is, the OECD is saying we're not done with BEPS, we're just beginning with BEPS. We've got 4, and what we've got is recommendations, and we're going to try to get more coherence, more harmonization going on, because the idea is that country practices are expected to converge over time. Some examples, well, there are too many to mention, but in Action Plan 2, adopt hybrid mismatch rules. In Action Plan 5, report IP regimes to the OECD. In Action Plan 6, add double non-tax declarations and saving clauses to treaties. In Action Plan 7, adopt anti-PE avoidance rules. In 8 to 10, the beloved transfer pricing rules, revise the allocation rules to source income from intangibles differently, to attribute value according to important functions, to assign only risk-free returns to financial transactions. And then finally, there are many best practices, again, an agreed general direction, and here the OECD will provide guidance to support implementation. So we can see there's a creeping, coherent structure here, creeping harmonization. The standards, we've all agreed we're doing it now, and if we don't do it, then there must have to be some consequences or it's meaningless. The recommendations are recommendations. It would be nice if you did them. This is what we think you could do. And the best practices are, well, what is that? That's just something I say would be a nice thing if we all did. It would be nice if we all conserved energy too, but I'm not going to enforce it upon you. So, there are many of these, but some examples are disclosing uncertain tax positions, mandatory binding arbitration. There are 11 best practices for that. And some things are going to be monitored even without a minimum standard, a recommendation, or a best practice. I don't know where to put them, so I guess I have to put them in best practices because they aren't, in fact, recommendations or minimum standards, and they're not described as best practices. But what do you call something that the OECD is going to monitor through peer review, but doesn't tell you what to do? So they are interest deductibility, CFC rules, and development zone rules. Okay, my last slide. The implementation architecture. So here, if you come to this place with me and you say, okay, the International Tax Order has hard law and soft law, and it's so clear, although I didn't say it, countries are in charge of hard law, and non-countries, non-state actors are in charge of soft law. But the OECD is changing that assumption, and I think that this implementation architecture shows us why, or how they're changing that assumption. So remember, there are 5 ways that the OECD can disseminate norms: domestic law and practice, bilateral treaties, the multilateral instrument, the OECD model guidance, and peer review. And there are 4 minimum standards. So where are they? How is the OECD going to get countries to do them, whether they're OECD members or BEPS associates or not, or whatever they are? So the first one is CBC reporting, country by country reporting. So you'll see that we'll put Brazil, you as a BEPS associate or a member of the G20 or however, whatever label you want to put on that, you're going to adopt CBC reporting in domestic legislation. And then you're going to have CBC exchange of rulings in your treaties. And then the OECD is also going to put possibly, I put this in brackets because it's not clear yet, the OECD hasn't always decided. Yep, you got it. Actually it's 3, but I'll take 5. Very generous. I put that in brackets because the OECD in some cases has not in fact clarified what they're going to do here, but it seems that they're going to put it in the model treaty. And then peer review is going to be compliance with the standard. So the standard is going to be, here's the country by country reporting standard. It looks a lot like law. It talks about thresholds and caps and required documentation. You, Brazil, are going to implement this. You're going to pass a law, and we're going to check to see if you did. If you don't, we don't say. Remember, this is soft law. We want to be vague about what happens if countries don't do what they say they're going to do. The harmful tax practices, don't do harmful tax practices. It comes down to an IP, an intellectual property nexus rule. Where is it? Well, again, you're going to adopt an IP nexus rule in your domestic law unless you already have one. And you're going to have peer monitoring to see, did you adopt a nexus rule in your law? If you don't know what the nexus rule is, well, you just go to the OECD website because that's where the rules are laid out and the standards are laid out. So then, principal purpose test of anti-treaty shopping. Well, that doesn't make sense in domestic law, so you can adopt that in domestic law, but you're going to adopt it in treaties. All new treaties going forward should have PPT, principal purpose test, LOB, limitation on benefits test, or a combination of the two. Now remember that PPT is something you can choose instead of the LOB. You can choose either one, but if you go with the LOB, here it's not going to be the OECD writing the rule, it's going to be the United States. The OECD wrote in that action plan that they're waiting for the US to, they were then waiting for the US to release the LOB, which the US did in the form of a new US model earlier this year. And that's the standard. So that's where you'll find that one when you're ready to write your next treaty. And it will also, of course, then be, these options will be in the multilateral instrument possibly, or maybe only in OECD model. It's not clear to me because that multilateral instrument is a beast of its own, which I could spend another presentation on all by itself. But here you'll also see a saving clause, which is a US invention, and a modified preamble, which is a means of getting a general anti-avoidance rule, a GAR, into a treaty by having a statement of intention of treaties. Okay, and then again, compliance with the standard. So the OECD is going to set up a forum to check to see if everybody's doing the PPT, the LOB, the anti-conduit, or whatever. And then finally, dispute resolution, the fourth standard. You're supposed to improve it. And so somehow in your domestic administration, your competent authority has to figure out a way to improve MAP compliance, improve their MAP time down to 24 months. We expect to see a multilateral map, and mandatory binding arbitration will be an option that you'll have to opt into in the multilateral instrument. So we'll see how that works out, whether countries will agree to mandatory binding arbitration or not. And then, of course, the OECD will revise it in the model and cycle through with compliance with the standard. Again, you'll be checking each other. So here's our four standards. That's how they're imposed. And then there's this mess of recommendations and best practices, and some of them are subject to peer review, so they're worth talking about. So the recommendations kind of go, we don't really know where they're going to come out, but it seems like they would have to come out somewhere in the OECD model or guidance, or they have to come out in the multilateral instrument. Somewhere these things are going to have to be clarified. But peer review is the key to BEPS 2.0, because we're going to be peer reviewing access of the OECD to data, country by country, country level data on all these different practices. So we're building a database at the OECD of what countries do. That's a statistical function of the OECD. That's what they use. That's what the OECD started to be. That's what its purpose was, to gather data on OECD countries and do comparative statistical analysis. And now we have the whole world involved in that project of giving data to the OECD to engage in statistical analysis. So we know that if the OECD is collecting data on all of these practices, that the point of that is to see, well, where can the next convergence step be, and how will we disseminate it? And so that means that when the OECD says we're going to peer review interest deductibility rules, but we're not going to tell you what the standard is, and we don't necessarily have a recommendation, but we might have best practices, what we know they're doing in peer monitoring is developing the standard for the next go around. So if you're not there, a BEPS associate, then you will also be left out of the next round of the international tax regime. So the problem just continues. And then the last thing is CFC definitions. If anyone who's been really paying attention to the BEPS project knows that controlled foreign corporations was probably the item of least agreement at the OECD level, precisely because CFC definitions are so tricky. And it's not necessarily the case that countries have the same perspective on what those rules should look like. So that divergence has been reflected in, well, we won't tell you what to do, we'll give you some best practices, but we're going to be collecting as much data as we can and studying this so that we'll have something to say the next time, and then we'll bring it through this cycle to disseminate again. So I bring this to the table, and I stop right there. And I know that makes people very frustrated, because what have I told you? All I've told you is here's what the OECD is doing, and here's how they're doing it, and isn't it interesting how the OECD, a non-government, is providing law, is writing law, and making things that start out as ideas and making them happen. So I stop there because I don't know what we should think about that. But what I do know is that this implementation architecture is built on the premise that countries that were not at the OECD working parties when they devised this whole structure will now agree to it and implement it with same rigor and force as countries that were at the table. I think that's wrong. I think that's an incorrect assumption. I think it's much safer to assume that if you were not invited to participate, if your opinion was not sought at the beginning, then you may agree begrudgingly to the framework handed to you, but it does not make you an enthusiastic participant. It makes you a participant whose voice has not been heard. And so I expect that this implementation architecture, the sole project here is to build for the next go-round. So I think it makes sense to pay attention to these structures and decide whether these are things that can be used strategically to gain a policy voice at the OECD or not. If you're not an OECD member, that's a very tough question, and I think it's worth considering. Again, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.